Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, it's Susan Coffin, and you are listening to Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts Audio. Our topic today is project-based learning, and we're so pleased to welcome Susan Kologi, who will talk about how to engage and how to energize students with ADHD and LD via project-based learning, both at school and at home. You know, for many kids with ADHD or with LD, for them, the traditional school classroom is not really conducive to learning. Listening to lectures, taking notes, sitting passively writing papers, filling in notebooks, it's not the natural form of learning for kids who have language disabilities or attentional deficits. They need to touch, to experience, to interact with concepts and with the real-life issues they're studying. So for them, a more impactful method of education can be project-based learning, sometimes referred to as PBL. So some elementary schools and some secondary schools do integrate PBL methods, but many do not. And the good news is that Susan Kologi will be talking today about how parents and teachers can boost any child's education using PBL. And some of the strategies that she'll talk about today will be ones that you can put to use in your classroom, or you can ask your child's teacher to put in use. She'll be addressing some of the following, a little more detail on why traditional classrooms are counterproductive for kids with ADHD and with LDs, the benefits of PBL for students with ADHD or LDs, and how to set up those experiences for your kids at home, how projects can be set up in the classroom, and how all students can be supported in the PBL environment. And then lastly, she'll give some examples of successful project-based learning projects and why and how they change students' understanding and learning. Let me introduce Susan to you. She is a doctorate from the University of Idaho, where she worked with undergraduate students who are learning to be teachers. And her dissertation research focused on project-based learning with all kinds of learners. She's the academic director and a teacher at the Novitas Academy in Emmett, Idaho, where she works with teachers and students implementing project-based learning. So with that, let me turn it over to Susan. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be here to share such a great way to have students learn information by participating with the information. So just really quickly, I want to give a very quick overview of just who I am. I want to give you a quick example that I typically do at conferences. Just talk about the definition and background briefly of PBL. Look at ADHD connections. We know that there's quite a few pros and some cons there, so we'll talk about those and how to support that in the classroom or at home. I'll share some of my favorite examples that I've done with my students, a little bit of research, and then I'll give you some tips and ways to share your information. About me, I am the academic director at Novitas Academy, but I'm a teacher first. And I really like to say that because I'm not just an administrator administering things and telling my teachers what to do, but I'm also teaching. Right now I'm doing math, which is probably the most difficult subject I found to be more project-based learning. So I really jump at the opportunity when I can. When I was going to school for education, I took a psychology class. And it was so interesting to me to learn how people learn about things and how they develop. So since my bachelor's degree, I've been trying to really marry those two subjects. And I found that hands-on learning and active learning are really great ways to keep and hold information and then use it later. So that's kind of where I came up with, project-based learning is a really cool idea. So I, like my intro said, I use that with my dissertation and have still been doing it. So let's get started. When I present at conferences, I start out with a quick activity, and this is what I show them. I say, how do tension and compression affect the structure of a building? And then I ask them to form groups and discuss the question amongst themselves. And then while they're talking about it, I bring materials to their table. And if you guys have attended conferences, it's very traditional. There are just chairs and there's a podium at the front and the person is supposed to stand there and talk. So it's interesting to see how people that attend that adapt to the surroundings. So sometimes they'll push chairs together to make a little table. But I hand out spaghetti and marshmallows and I say, your goal is to answer this question above. And instead of asking you to run to your Pantry is really quick to grab these materials. I'm just going to show you some that it actually looks like. So students may not know the definitions of these words yet, and that's okay. You can kind of consider this a pretest and then teach the words by referring back to the structure. So when you're talking about tension, you can say, oh, do you remember what it felt like when the spaghetti was held together with these marshmallows? And this is where background knowledge in Vygotskian perspective are really useful. So here's some more examples. It was really fun to get people engaged rather than just sitting and listening to me. So just a quick little background, constructing knowledge is one of the best ways to learn. And there's several different ways to do it. Project-based learning isn't really a new concept. It's become more popular lately, but most of the research was done mid-1990s. But even Dewey back in 1916 said that we need to participate in learning and we'll be more interested if we can draw from those experiences. And to the left, constructivism, active learning, experiential learning, collaborative learning, project or even problem-based learning, those are all examples and almost like a hierarchy of different ways of constructing knowledge within this constructivist framework. And these all have pros and cons. They're really great to use, and it even includes using simple manipulatives in math class or making slime or just simple little things that you can add into your instruction that really create a fun environment. Just looking at a quick definition, I underline the words that are really important. Engaging students in learning through extended inquiry. So that's another word that we all know is this inquiry process. But the key feature here is that it's structured around complex, authentic questions. So the question is really what drives the instruction. And to the right, we see, it's central to the curriculum. Obviously, teachers need to teach what they need to teach. But that driving question portion, that is really what the whole point is. Doing a project is fun, yes, but you need to be able to show what you've learned. So students do constructive investigation, and there's a handful of standards even that want students to be able to do this on their own. Being autonomous, you got to scaffold this a little bit, and we'll talk about different ways to do that later on. And just having a conversation with students or kids about this is real life. We all do projects within our jobs, at school, in college, all of these different areas. We're always working with other people, so it's collaborative. And we're always completing something, sometimes from scratch on our own. So I put the ultimate integration at the bottom, and that's really what I like to call PBL, because there's so many different things you can integrate into one project, and I'll show you that later. Just a quick overview of characteristics of a traditional classroom. This will probably look familiar to all of us. These may or may not be 100% true for everyone, but I just tried to compile most of the things we generally see. So there's arranged desks. Some classrooms might have tables. Students are expected to sit quietly, focus on directions. There's usually a lecture or some type of assignment. Students need to be organized, to raise their hand, to put all their papers away, get to class before bell rings because there's bell work, follow directions once they're said, pay close attention to details. That's a difficult one for a lot of kids, and eventually this will pay off. So those are a lot of things that we usually see, but if we look at the characteristics of ADHD, it's kind of the opposite. And again, these are just some characteristics that may or may not be true for everyone, but having difficulty remaining seated is going to cause some problems in a traditional classroom. Fidgeting with hands and feet, or appearing restless, squirming around, so they're not able to sit quietly. There's definitely some difficulty sustaining attention. We probably all know this and have seen it in real time. Losing items, so they're not very organized. Blurting out answers doesn't work when it's supposed to be a quiet classroom, and students need to raise their hand when they want to ask a question or answer a question. Again, staying organized, that flexibility of shifting from one task to another, difficulty listening to full directions. Some students, especially if they have another LD along with ADHD, they might hear the first thing that you ask them to do. And then they'll probably do that. Maybe they'll hear the last one as well. Difficulty with detail. A lot of these kids are big picture or very detail oriented, but then can't connect it. So you're going to need some scaffolding there as well. And difficulty delaying gratification. We all know the marshmallow test. If you don't, I recommend looking it up. There's some fantastic videos on YouTube. But delaying that gratification is something hard to do with a lot of kids, but especially the ones with impulse control issues. So going to the next slide, again, I have the same characteristics of ADHD down the left, but then I have characteristics of a project-based learning classroom. And this is kind of my style of PBL. Each teacher or each parent, each person has their own style, and it can be more flexible or more structured. Really, it's a key of finding what is going to work best for you and your students at that time. So my classroom probably looks like chaos to anybody looking in, but students are moving around, so they don't have to stay seated all the time. Even having a variety of seating. So we have tables, I even have standing desks and fit desks. So it's a very active classroom with a lot of moving parts. Checklists, and I'm going to talk more about checklists because I think they are key in being successful in project-based learning, especially with LD kids. And you might use checklists at home with your kids. And if it's successful, great, then use it everywhere else you can. My classroom, there's stuff everywhere, and the students know where everything is so they can get it on their own. So the items are in and around the classroom. There's always some kind of discussion going on, so students don't have to sit quietly. They can blurt out answers, but usually they're talking in a discussion anyway with their peers. Again, checklists, calendars, binders, and we'll talk some more about those things. So as we can see, the characteristics of ADHD don't really work well with traditional classrooms. And I'm sure that's why many of you are here today, even listening, because you know that it doesn't work. And then we see that some characteristics are really great in a PBL classroom. So all of my students have ADHD. If I look at all of their paperwork, every single one of them has it, and most of them have the same subtype. But in person, they couldn't be more opposite. And it's almost funny how it's like, oh, these two students should be about the same. But when I work with them in the classroom, it's completely opposite, and we need different accommodations for each student. And that's what makes PBL really fun, actually, is you can figure out strengths and weaknesses and then work with both of those. So we're a pretty strengths-based program, and I find that's a good way to recognize, oh, this person is good at organizing. So let's pair you with somebody who's maybe not as organized, that has a skill that you could probably work on too. And just listing a few characteristics of ADHD, just looking at these this way: aggression, being fidgety, forgetting things, other learning differences, depression, anxiety, excitement, all of these things, if you list them like that, they don't look like they're going to fit with PBL. But here's some pictures of my students and some of the projects we've done, and I found that they actually have a lot of advantages because they can kind of focus on more than one thing at a time. Maybe not fully, but as you can see, the picture on the right, we're working on gardening things, and they're having discussion while they're learning all of these things. So there are some weaknesses as well, but it offers a different type of learning experience. So some kids are a little socially awkward, or they have other executive functioning deficits. So that's an opportunity, a teaching moment for a teacher or a parent or an aide to step in and work through that situation. and help them understand that that's okay, and let's figure out how to work on that. So it offers an extra learning experience for some of those kids. So there are a number of skills that are necessary for project-based learning, but also gained from project-based learning. And the ones you see on the screen here are mostly research-based, but I found that PBL is a great way to help students work on other executive functioning skills. And working memory is really important because you have a lot of things in your head. You need to remember dates and the list of things you need to do, and you need to gather information. You need to talk to your peers. And that's why we can provide some scaffolding and structure for those students. Time management is another big one. And you can still accommodate using all of their accommodations and things that you normally do with them within this PBL environment. So this is a very quick model that just simplifies the basic process of project-based learning. So you set it up either as a parent or as a teacher or a group of adults who are going to be doing this project, creating the driving question. And I'm going to come back to the driving question because that's, again, really important. Creating groups, and I always say a group of one is okay because students will be collaborating anyway. They'll be sharing resources. They'll be learning from each other. Another important feature is creating an assessment. Projects seem fun and great, but did the students actually learn from that experience? So having that assessment is also really important. So students are researching, they're communicating, they're working collaboratively. And then at the end, there's a final product, a presentation, and then the assessment. And this can be different for each type of, project that you're working on. It may look different. Sometimes maybe students are presenting to their peers, or they're presenting to somebody in the community or the school board. There's an example I'll talk about where students were designing wings for an airplane, and they presented their product and their designs to an actual engineer. So there's a lot of different ways that you can, share that information, but then also evaluate the process. This is kind of a watered down version of how I work with teachers and parents to begin to utilize project-based learning. I have some more documents on this, and I'd be happy to share those as well. But these are kind of the big things to focus on. Obviously, selecting a topic, try to integrate it with other subjects, make those real-life connections, use current events, and then, of course, look at your objectives and standards. And I'll show you ways that you can create your driving question from an objective or a standard. So that's the next piece, is deciding on and defining your objectives. So what do you want the students to learn from the project? And that can be, interacting with groups as well. So you want to add some of those social components to that. Again, creating a driving question, it's going to drive the project. Understanding background knowledge, this is going to help you know where to add that extra instruction. So I really find that mixing mini lessons and project-based learning is the best way to go. Again, you need to find that balance with the students that you're working with and your style of teaching as well. And then preparing a student checklist. Again, giving them a procedure, what needs to be completed, when it does, and that's going to help them with different skills. And for every student, I know a lot of students are working on some of these things, especially if they're younger. So driving questions, it clearly states the purpose of the project. So I keep referring back to this, but this is key. It focuses on the task. It's linked to the core of what the students really need to learn. And a great part is that it connects to Common Core standards. So if you're utilizing those, and it provides differentiation for your lower students and for your higher students, and the students right in the middle. So I'm going to show you a few examples of how you can take a standard and create a question out of it. And not all standards should be project-based learning driven, but rather just supported. And some of them connect really well to just be a driving question. Again, I found the combination of the mini lessons within project-based learning is going to be your best way to go. So a standard compare and contrast stories in the same genre on their approaches to similar themes and topics. So that looks like a 5th grade. So a driving question, what characteristics do books within the same genre have in common? What are the differences? So that driving question is still going to get what the students need to learn. But you as the teacher or the parent need to evaluate and assess that. And if they didn't understand it, then go back and reteach. So you're going to use the same teaching methods that you've always used, but just doing it in a different way or a different order. A few more, looking at speakers' arguments. So you could ask, what kind of information would you need to evaluate the authenticity of a speaker's argument? And this is a 2-part question. How do you use this information? So a driving question can be a couple questions. It can be a statement and a question, and it's really up to you guys to create, what exactly you want them to know. Looking at addition and subtraction, why do those strategies work? We know that there's different strategies on adding and subtracting, but why do each one of them work? And that's a really neat metacognitive activity for even older students. This is a 2nd grade standard, but I find even with my high schoolers, just thinking about why those strategies work is really important. And they can transfer that to other areas into their math now. So this is an example, and it's from the Buck Institute, and they are a project-based learning center, and they do fantastic things. So I just wanted to show you a large example of how all of their standards, all of the concepts are incorporated into this one big project. So the theme is high school food court, and the project scenario is basically a student council is given a list of restaurants who want to be incorporated into the school's food court. So it's up to the student council to select those based on economic laws, so demand and supply. So students are given total revenue. They need to be able to compute that, the cost data, the daily cost, daily profit, and then they make a decision based on all of that information. And it addresses the economic standards. The students create a know list, a need to know list, and then they actually create part of their own driving question. And this is another really great way to get students involved in that process. It should be guided by an adult or a teacher or a parent or somebody who knows what they need to know to help guide that process. And using mini lessons, again, combining the two to talk about how you can find total revenue, how you find the daily cost and the profit, so you know that they know what they're doing. And then at the final project, it's a presentation, an assessment, and a debrief. So the student council is now presenting to the school board on, we want these 5 restaurants and why, and they have all the data to show. And then, of course, there's an assessment on supply and demand, and then a discussion. And the discussion is also really key to keep in mind when you're asking students to do something new and different. A few ways you can incorporate this at home is really using inquiry-based projects. And I'll give a few more examples too. But when I was a kid, I was in a 4-H group, but we focused on projects rather than animals. But I still remember so many things I learned about survival skills, tying knots. I did a sewing project once, and I remember all of those details very vividly. And that's why I really think this is an important thing to bring into kids' lives in different areas. So if your school doesn't do it, then incorporate it at home in any way you can. So like the example I started out with attention and compression, with spaghetti and marshmallows, just give kids supplies and ask them to create something. but then followed up with discussion. So you want to ask what they come up with and why it might happen. So that why is really important. Do a project when planning a vacation or a day at the park or something around town. And I'll give you a few examples of things we've done at school that you could easily do on vacation. And this isn't on the slide, but if you have after school programs or a 4-H club, Scouts or FFA, a lot of those really are project-based. So students, kids are completing things and they can earn things for doing them, but that knowledge that they gain goes a lot farther. So supporting ADHD. So you can still use accommodations from their IEP 504, that you need to anyway, and follow suggestions from psychoeducational evaluations. Those things can still be used within that differentiated classroom. So probably one of the most important things for you as the person in charge of this is you have to be organized in the preparation. So this is kind of where a lot of these projects fail or don't necessarily succeed in the best way they could, is not following through with all of the steps or knowing all of the steps. And talking about how this is real life and give examples. There's a great YouTube video, and it talks about a teacher in Seattle that uses, in his physics classroom, the students were doing wing structures, and they presented it to the engineers. And that's a real life concept. That's what some students will be doing as part of their career. Again, it's what we do as well. And I like to call it unstructured structure. So PBL is pretty unstructured. So that's your job to put some structure back into it, especially for students with ADHD, because we know what they need. We know that they have executive functioning deficits, so we have to support that. And I will give you a few examples in a moment. But a lot of students struggle with project-based learning right away because it's something different. We're asking them to think differently, to do a different type of process in school that they're not used to. So it's important to kind of scaffold that process for everyone. A few strategies. I think I do all of these probably every day. Making a calendar and have it in the middle of the classroom so students are always looking at it. Creating a checklist. I think this, again, is the most important piece that you can give the students to use. I combine a checklist and calendar, and I have it in my classroom. So they can see the time and the date and what needs to be done, and they can check it off. So there's a lot of different ways you can set that up. Doing daily check-ins. So sometimes I do this maybe 3 or 4 times within an hour. Again, you just have to know your students and build that relationship to know what they need and then provide that support. That is sometimes difficult when you are one teacher and you have 30 students. That's where your groups are going to come in to be very useful, where you can bounce back and forth from group to group. And PBL as a teacher, it's a lot of time and energy, but when you start the process, it goes really smoothly. So it is a lot of work up front, but then you're not necessarily planning lessons every day, and you're not connecting all of these things, but you're just monitoring and guiding the process. Modeling and providing different examples is really important, but try not to give it all away so you don't hinder their creativity. So that's an important piece too, is students are just supposed to show what they learned. And that's where this product comes in and what they're presenting. So you want to give some examples, but maybe provide an example from a different project or a different driving question. Or if that student really needs an example and they kind of copy it, that's okay, especially if it's the first couple times. Again, we want to scaffold them into this PBL process. Again, modeling executive functioning skills. As the teacher, you need to do this as well. So filling out the calendar on the wall or taking notes yourself. So you want to be a model for that as well. And then freedom to work, time, space, resources, peers. It does take a lot of time within your classroom, but that's what's so great about it, is that if the students have time to learn together, then they will. So scaffolding, again, PBL is difficult for a lot of students to just jump into right away. So you want to start off by using just a very small one. You can use it as the anticipatory set, the intro to your lesson. So just like we started out with tension and compression, that activity could take, a half an hour. With older kids, it might take 15 minutes, and then having a discussion about it. So start out with something small and manageable, and to get yourself used to it, but also to get your students used to it. Next time, try using a longer one or a lesson for 2 days. So building, making it bigger, and then helping students understand the process, again, is important. So discussing that with them, guiding the process, being a model, discussing those different metacognitive strategies that are going on. And then start to integrate more subjects. So this expands knowledge, it definitely gets more standards, and then you have more time. So you could start by combining English and social studies. Those are 2 easy subjects to combine. Or math and science. There's usually some type of math involved with science. And that's the best way to do math project-based learning, is to have it within another subject. So you can kind of connect those big ideas. And then do it regularly. Do it once a week. Combine it with another class. So maybe all 4th grade teachers, they're doing one big project together. Or have the project go for a whole unit, or even for the whole year. There's several schools now, some of them are charter schools, that this is what they do. They have combined classrooms that everything is just a project, and they're still meeting all the requirements that they need to do. So some of my favorite examples, I'll just briefly go over. This one was on current events, and this we actually did last year with Hurricane Matthew, but could definitely be done now, today. Looking at the driving question, hurricanes are powerful and at times potentially catastrophic natural phenomena. Why do some communities respond better than others? So we had noticed throughout the years that some communities or countries or states did different things, and it either worked out better or worse. So looking at why that happened. So last year we looked at Hurricane Matthew specifically. Each student took on a role of a governor, an engineer, a citizen, a meteorologist. I think we added a few more in there if they were interested in something. And they researched hurricanes from that perspective. So they still learned all of what they needed to about hurricanes, but then a little bit more. So an engineer would need to look at the structure of buildings. The meteorologist would need to look more at the weather patterns. And then because the students presented that information, all students could gain more information about the whole big picture. Again, to answer that question, why do some communities respond better than others? We did this at a family workshop on our campus, and I had parents go through this process. And I think that's really important, even to just get buy-in from parents in the community, is we know that projects are great, but what are students actually gaining from it? So having the parents or families be involved in that process, it's actually really great to see. When we did it here, the parents walked out and said, wow, this is really cool. And sometimes to hear parents say that is great, is to have that feedback. So anytime, again, you can involve, if you are a parent, go participate in it at school. One that's a little more standards based, this was a World War I unit, And this is probably my favorite project to talk about, mostly because it was student-driven. So the students really had the idea, but we were learning about how does necessity promote innovation and strength during warfare. So different types of wars and different types of environments required different things to survive. So again, looking at how people can adapt to that. So the students were going to create models of trenches. And one of the students said, well, why don't we just go dig it in the backyard? And I do have the luxury of being able to do that here at school. So we did. And it was great because it incorporated all of our subjects. Students needed to research and organize teams for the trench construction. Me as the math teacher required the trenches be 1/3 of the size of the originals from World War I. So students were using their math concepts, doing some fractions that we all love. Students were also doing persuasive speeches in their speech class. In health, they were doing public health policy and disease prevention. So it kind of magically incorporated all of these things. And sometimes project-based learning is that. That's the beauty of it. It can be very organized from the teacher's perspective, but then also the students can be involved in that and kind of create it and drive it to go somewhere else. To incorporate the English and the history, and this I felt was really important because a lot of my students even are really obsessed with war because it's cool, there's explosions and all of these things happen. But to help them realize that it is real life, students were researching an actual soldier from that time. And we decided to reenact a fake war with paintball in our trenches, but we held a ceremony on Veterans Day, and the students wrote eulogies for that soldier they were researching, and they read it. So it was a really great way to combine their interest, something they thought they wanted to learn about. It connected to what we were doing in our curriculum and in all of our classes. But then the students were able to respect what all of it was about. These are two other examples where I call the ultimate integration. And this is where I want to pull in, if you're a parent, things that you can do on vacation or on the weekend. These are some really great ways to do that. So our summer program here is centered around an adventure therapy trip. So students go rafting or kayaking for weeks. So last year they did the San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington. And before they went, we learned about the ecology, the history of the area, the Native American population there. We read Hatchet. So we learned kind of about their survival. In math, we talked about budgeting, of course. That's a great way to tie in any kind of budget is to a trip. We even looked at tides and moon phases, angles of the kayaks and how much weight they can hold. So you can really incorporate all of these big ideas that you do in class, but actually seeing it. So then the students went to the San Juan Islands, did a week-long kayaking trip. And then when they came back, we were able to use all that information that they learned and that they saw there. So, and again, because it's our summer program, it's a little more flexible. So we had the students kind of drive the next month of instruction. So from this one trip, we talked about survival and debating different factors and attributes of people who have survived. So it was a great way to tie in something that they were going to do on vacation. The one we just did this past summer was Green River, Utah. We included Wilderness First Aid, which is a great program if anybody has the opportunity to do that. And this time we had each student do some type of scientist role. So we had a biologist, a geologist, anthropologist. So each student had their own job title and description. So when they went there, they needed to collect data and bring it back to the scientists here on campus, because not every student goes. So we have to be creative in finding a way for the students to share that information. So, and I wrote this PowerPoint when the students were still doing that, and we branched off into different civilizations that were created out around rivers and talked about why that's important, and then saw how it's different today. So again, these are great ways to bring in, again, weekend activities if you are planning a vacation, if you are able to go to a school that does things like this. It's a great and easy way to make it happen. So I wanted to provide some citations of research that focuses specifically on project-based learning and ADHD. There is a lot on project-based learning, and I am more than happy to provide that for you, but these ones specifically tie the two together. And not all of them are 100% positive, but that's an important part of research, is to see both sides. So there are pros and cons, but it's in how you do it. So the research was showing that these cons, why the projects weren't successful or the students didn't learn that information, it was all in how the teacher organized it or how the project was done. So I think that might be a new direction of research, is to not only look at ADHD and kids with other LDs, but to really look at the structure of the projects. And finally, just resources and tips. I wanted to share the Buck Institute again. This is their website, and I love using their government and econ curricula. Those are my favorites. But they have a lot of other resources and videos. They have a conference every year where you can go and learn how to do this. So some tips that I have is use a buddy system. So have somebody, either a partner teacher or somebody at a different school, or if you're a parent, try it with your neighbors. Just have somebody to be there with you to go through it. It's quite the challenge, and it's scary for a lot of teachers, really, because it's a whole different way of doing it. But taking a chance, having fun, and utilizing the resources you have. So like I mentioned at the conferences, when I did the spaghetti and marshmallows, we didn't have tables. So you just kind of make do with what you do have, because I know as a teacher, there's not necessarily a lot of resources readily available at that time. Going with the flow, that's really important just as a teacher in general, or anybody that works with kids with ADHD. You just kind of have to go with the flow. And after a few of these presentations I've done, I found that a lot of people have a lot of questions, and that's fantastic. So I started a Facebook group page. It's called Project-Based Learning Community, where we have several teachers and parents on there to share their ideas and to support each other. I do put a lot of my resources on there. We look at different news articles, we have a discussion. So that's a really great format to be able to share those ideas. So I invite you, your family, teachers at school, anybody to join this group to help support each other.
This is great. Susan, I have a question for you. Can you take one of these wonderful examples and talk about how you as a teacher behind the scenes made this work? What was the planning process like? How did you manage the process?
And that's a great question, because it's not always the same. Again, you have to really go with the flow, but setting up that process is really important. So because we're a smaller school, I meet with all of the teachers and we outline what each teacher needs to be teaching for that class. So then we talk about the standards we need to do, what type of objectives we want to meet, and we create kind of like a crosswalk of everything that we need to do. Then we set up different checklists, of course, of what students need to be working on and kind of that timeline process. But really, a lot of the time we do need student feedback. So I had a student come over to the school during a vacation. We're a boarding school, so they live on campus. But I asked him, so what kind of things could we do on this vacation or this trip that we could learn more about? And that's where we came up with the scientist idea. So that one was a little more organized because each student had a specific role to fill. So having that task is going to be part of what drives it. So we have our driving question, but then having something for the students to do. And that really takes creativity and that collaboration within the teachers or the parents who are following through with that. So there were some days that my teachers and I would sit around for an hour or two and come up with these ideas. So if you're not an idea person, that's totally fine, but find somebody who does have some of that creativity to be able to help you do it. And that's really key, is to, again, finding that task for what the students really need to be doing.
Could you give us a timeline for one of these projects? Was it 3 months? Was it 1 month? And what, maybe a bit about what happened in each stage?
Okay. I'll use the World War I example of the trench warfare. This was great for our kids. Again, they all have ADHD, so they were outside. There were days that they were digging with shovels for an hour.
I love that. I love that idea.
I know. I don't necessarily recommend handing them all shovels, but it was a great outlet for them to, get some hands on and get that energy out. But that project lasted, I think, 3 weeks total, because within each class, they were still learning the information they needed to learn about all of these concepts that fit in with that. But then there was also the time where they were digging the trenches, and we went to the store and got, gear for them and things like that. So that one probably was like a unit long, so a couple weeks. The 2 vacation trips, those are a whole summer. But again, it was like one project that formed into other projects. So that was, 3 months or so. But I think finding what your students are capable of doing and that length of time is going to be really important. So, and that's where you have to go with the flow. As a teacher, you may have something great planned and you're like, okay, it's going to take 3 weeks to do this project. But we all know that students do things a little differently when we have everything planned. So it may go faster, it may need more time. And sometimes that's difficult within the school calendar, but there's different ways that you can, scaffold that process or give them more information, almost like giving them clues if you want them to move a little faster. Does that help answer to that question?
I think so, yeah. I'm still finding it hard to imagine how you set up and manage this process on a day-to-day basis. But anything that you can add to that would be helpful. One specific question that just came in is, how do you evaluate learning? How do you assess whether the students have internalized the core lesson material, for example, in a PBL activity?
Mm-hmm. And that's a really important part, right? Again, projects are cool, they're great, they're fun, but are the students actually learning? So you need to be assessing every time. Most of my projects, I just use the regular assessment that comes with my curriculum. Or when I did this with college students, I had them immersed in project-based learning, and we use the standardized assessment for that class. So there has been some research that shows students within project-based learning do score higher on regular standardized testing as well, because they learn the critical thinking skills and problem solving skills to be able to answer questions, even though they don't necessarily know the answer. So they're learning more than just content, but they're learning those skills. But I think part of creating an assessment too, rubrics are a great way. Of course, they're kind of those you love them or hate them ideas, but they are a great way to show, what's expected but then also have the students be rating themselves as well. So just using any of your regular assessments is a great way to start with that, and then go from there on what your students need.
Okay. Another question from Mariana. What's the optimal student-teacher ratio for an effective PBL classroom, especially in the K-5 younger students?
Sure. Again, well, it really depends on the skills of your students. So if they are all ADHD, you probably have to be really careful with that. I feel like if you had manageable groups, you could have more students in the class. So again, this is kind of part of what some of the research was showing, that it can be done with 5 students. It can be done with hundreds of students. And even the class that I was teaching at the University of Idaho, I had 72 students, I think, in one class, and they were able to do it. Again, they're adults, so they do have a little more skills. I would say in the elementary classroom, you're going to have probably 25, 30 kids in the class. So creating the manageable groups is going to be what you really want to focus on. And there you would probably assign student serves rather than let them choose themselves, or say, all right, we need 5 groups of 4 or something like that. So providing those guidelines so where you as the teacher is comfortable, but then also, you can manage it with your students.
Okay. Thank you. So a couple of questions about math activities, specifically ideas for teaching math, addition, multiplication, subtraction, division in elementary school through a project-based learning.
Mm-hmm. And I do have to admit, this is the part where I'm trying to figure out too. Half of me, I'm 100% PBL. The other half of me is a math teacher, is like, how do I get this to work? So that is something I'm still working on. I'm not necessarily an expert in that yet. Hopefully I will be. But I really think combining mini lessons with the manipulatives. So even with my high school kids in algebra, we're still using manipulatives as much as we can. So with math, I think using any type of active learning as opposed to full-on project-based is a great way, because there is so much background knowledge required that it is a little bit more difficult. So the project almost has to follow the instruction a little bit. So, and that's kind of hard for me to say because, part of me again is PBL all the way, but I understand that math is a little bit more complicated. So hopefully in the future, I will have more information about that as I kind of stumble through it myself.
That makes sense. Thank you. Several questions about kids who are not great writers, specifically, who have, weak reading and writing skills. Can they succeed with project-based learning? What are some thoughts about project-based learning with those kinds of children?
I think it's actually even better for kids with some type of writing deficits. The reading, you want to use, the reading strategies that they are working on, whether that's summarizing each paragraph, taking notes, whatever strategies they're already using. But then because there's a project involved, they could also write an essay, but just practice those skills. But they could also show a project that shows the information. So they're still working on the skills, but maybe more of their grade is focused on the project to see if they actually got the information. So there's a couple different ways you can kind of mold that to be the best for that student. And that's where that differentiation comes in as well. It's still, requiring them to do it, but maybe having the focus more on the presentation or the actual physical product rather than just an essay.
Okay. So we actually have one person who's answered the question that another person asked, which is
great. Good.
One person asked, I'm a board certified music therapist. Have you seen project-based learning happen in music class? And another person said, I teach music education at the university level, and I have a class with 3 students who are planning and implementing a chamber music concert. So, and they are both have ADHD. So that was an interesting response of a volunteer, activity at working on a concert in a music setting that I thought I'd share with the listeners.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really great. So a number of people have asked questions about how to get your school's administration on board, specifically people who have kids in public schools where they don't see much project-based learning happening. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, I do have to say I'm lucky because I am the administrator. But for a lot of public schools, I know it's not a focus. So my advice would be to pull together the research, which I've conveniently done for everyone through my dissertation, and say, hey, this shows that students learn more and they do better on standardized testing. Even bringing that in because principals know that they need to pass standardized tests. So they'd probably be willing to take a chance on something that is research-based. And, whatever process you are comfortable with or that your school board uses, is approach it that way. But it could be as simple as talking with the classroom teacher and say, hey, what do you think about this? And then kind of having it stem from there, or, creating not necessarily a giant presentation, but talking with the principal or other administrators, even the counselors, because they understand how kids learn too. That's part of their instruction when they were going through school, is to get somebody interested and then present the research. I think that sounds great.
That research page is super helpful. Thank you. Can you tell me the name of your Facebook group? What is it called?
It is called Project-Based Learning Community.
Okay. Well, Susan, thank you so much. This is fascinating. And I'm sure your students are very lucky to have such a great and dynamic project-based learning in their classroom. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. And we're signing off. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
My buddy Kyle here is going to help me tell you about Corteva
and
the power of
and.
You see, Intrepid Edge insecticide combines fast knockdown
and
lasting residual activity for proven results.
And
it has 2 modes of action that deliver effective control against robbing insects, like leaf miners
and
armyworms
and
corn borers
and
loopers.
And
oh, lunchtime. Thanks, Kyle.
And
visit intrepidedge.corteva.us to learn more.